You've been flagged. Step aside. The sentence didn't echo, but it didn't need to. It sliced clean through the quiet like it belonged there, like it had been waiting for someone exactly like her to walk in, and Danielle Carter stopped mid-stride. Not startled, not confused, just still, her hand resting lightly against the polished glass counter as the analyst behind the screen avoided eye contact. Fingers hovering over a keyboard like they had already made the decision before she even spoke. The space around them was pristine, modern, the kind of place where silence meant control and everything moved with quiet precision. But now that silence felt different, charged, like something unseen had just shifted. Danielle didn't rush to speak, didn't demand an explanation. She simply tilted her head slightly, eyes moving from the screen to the man in front of her, then to the reflection of data flickering faintly across the glass, absorbing everything in a way that made time feel slower around her. I just need access to my account, she said, her voice even, unhurried, but the analyst shook his head before she even finished. Access is restricted. Your profile doesn't meet the criteria for this tier. And there it was again, not loud, not aggressive, just certain. The kind of certainty that didn't come from facts but from assumption. A woman in a tailored navy blazer approached from the side, her heels quiet but deliberate against the floor, her eyes scanning Danielle once from head to toe before settling into a polite smile that didn't quite reach her expression. Is there an issue here? She asked, though her tone suggested she had already decided the answer, and the analyst nodded slightly. System flagged her account, he said, and the manager's smile tightened just enough to reveal something colder underneath. Ma'am, if the system flagged you, there's usually a reason, she said, her voice calm but edged with something rehearsed, something practiced, like she had said this before. Danielle didn't react, not outwardly, but something in her posture shifted, subtle, almost invisible, like a line being drawn somewhere, deeper than the surface, her gaze drifting back to the screen where rows of data scrolled quietly, patterns hidden in plain sight, and behind the desk, a junior developer glanced up from his monitor, his brow tightening as he noticed a discrepancy, something small but persistent, a flag that didn't align with the data it was tied to. But before he could speak, the manager stepped closer, her voice firmer now. We'll need you to step aside while we review this further. And a security officer near the entrance adjusted his stance, not moving forward, not yet, but close enough to make the suggestion clear. Danielle exhaled slowly, not out of frustration, but control, the kind that came from experience, from having seen this moment before in different rooms, with different faces, wearing different versions of the same expression, and for a brief second her mind flickered elsewhere, years back, standing in another office, another polished lobby, hearing a different voice say almost the exact same words. You don't fit the profile we're looking for. And she remembered how that moment didn't break her, didn't stop her. It refined her, sharpened something inside that never dulled again. Back in the present, the room felt tighter now, the air heavier, as if everyone was waiting for her to either comply or react. But Danielle did neither. Instead, she reached calmly into her pocket, pulled out her phone, and tapped once, deliberate, precise. Then lifted her eyes to meet the manager's, her voice steady, almost quiet. Run a live audit on your flagging system, she said, and the analyst blinked, caught off guard, the manager's expression flickering for just a moment before resetting. That's not something we do on request, she replied, but Danielle didn't look away, didn't press harder. She simply held the moment, letting the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable for everyone else in the room, and somewhere behind them, the developer's screen flickered again, the anomaly widening, spreading across multiple profiles, too consistent to ignore, and his fingers hovered over the keyboard, unsure whether to speak or stay silent, because something about the woman at the counter felt different now, not louder, not more aggressive, just more certain, like she wasn't asking for access anymore. She was waiting for the system itself to reveal what it had been hiding all along. The room did not move, but everything inside it shifted. The analyst's screen flickered once, then again, the data no longer flowing in clean lines but stuttering as if something deeper had been disturbed, and the junior developer behind the desk leaned forward, eyes narrowing, his fingers hovering over the keyboard as the anomaly Danielle had noticed began to multiply, not randomly, not by error, but in a pattern too precise to ignore. The manager crossed her arms, her composure still intact. But thinner now, stretched. "This is not how our system works," she said, though her tone carried less certainty than before, and Danielle's gaze remained fixed on the screen, unblinking, as if she had already seen the outcome before anyone else realized there was one. "Then maybe it is time you see how it actually works," Danielle replied, her voice low, controlled, and something about the way she said it made the analyst hesitate, just for a second, before glancing back at his monitor. Because now the flags were spreading, profiles lighting up in red markers across different categories, different regions, but all tied to the same underlying variable, one the system was never supposed to prioritize. The developer swallowed, his voice barely above a whisper. "These flags are not random," he said, and the manager turned sharply toward him. "Then explain it," she demanded, but he did not answer immediately, because the explanation was forming in real time in front of him. And it was not one he could easily defend. Danielle shifted her weight slightly, her presence steady, unshaken, and for a brief moment her reflection in the glass merged with the data behind it, like she was not just observing the system but standing inside it, understanding it at a level no one else in the room could reach. "Run a demographic breakdown," she said calmly, not to the manager, not to the analyst, but to the room itself, and the analyst hesitated again, caught between protocol and something else, something he could not quite name before. Finally typing the command, his fingers slower now, deliberate, and when the results appeared the silence that followed was heavier than anything spoken so far. The red markers aligned, forming a pattern that was no longer subtle, no longer deniable, and the developer leaned back slightly, his voice steadier now but filled with disbelief. "This is targeting specific profiles," he said, and the manager shook her head immediately. "That is not possible," but her eyes betrayed her, scanning the screen, searching for an alternative explanation that did not exist. Danielle finally lifted her hand from the counter, straightening just enough to command the space without raising her voice. "It is not only possible," she said, "it is consistent." And the word landed harder than anything else, because consistency meant intention, and intention meant design. A few feet away, the security officer shifted again, uncertain now, no longer sure where the situation stood, because this was no longer about one person being denied access. It was about something much larger unfolding in real time. The developer's fingers moved again, pulling deeper logs, historical data, and with each layer the pattern repeated, month after month, decision after decision, invisible until now, and he shook his head slowly. "This has been happening for years," he said, almost to himself, and Danielle's expression did not change, but her eyes softened for just a fraction of a second, not in sympathy, but in recognition, because she had seen this before, not in code, not in systems, but in rooms, in conversations, in doors that quietly closed without explanation. The manager stepped back slightly, her confidence no longer holding. "There must be a mistake in the data," she said, but even as she spoke the words, they felt hollow, because the evidence was no longer abstract, it was visible, undeniable. And Danielle turned her head slowly to meet her gaze, her voice still calm, still precise. "The mistake is not in the data," she said, "it is in the assumption that the system was ever neutral," and that was the moment the room fully understood that this was no longer a simple denial, not a misunderstanding, but the beginning of something far more serious, something that could not be undone with a quick apology or a quiet correction, because once a system reveals what it has been doing, it does not go back to silence, and Danielle knew that better than anyone standing there because she was no longer waiting for access, she was watching the truth surface, layer by layer, until there was nothing left to hide. The silence did not break all at once, it cracked slowly, like glass under pressure, as every pair of eyes in the room fixed on the screen that no one wanted to look at just seconds ago, and the analyst's hands, once steady with routine, now hovered uncertainly as the system continued revealing more than it was ever designed to show. Danielle did not move, but the space around her felt different now. as if the center of gravity in the room had shifted toward her without permission, without announcement, and the manager, who had been so certain just moments earlier, took a small step back, barely noticeable but enough to signal the beginning of retreat, her voice lowering, losing that polished edge. "We need to pause this," she said, but no one responded, because the system was no longer something they could simply pause. The junior developer leaned in again, his voice gaining strength as clarity replaced doubt. "This is not an isolated issue," he said, pulling up deeper layers of data. "The algorithm is weighting variables it was never supposed to prioritize," and he hesitated before finishing the thought, because saying it out loud would make it real. "It is filtering based on identity markers." The words landed heavy, undeniable, and for the first time, the analyst turned fully toward Danielle, searching her face not for answers, but for confirmation, because she had seen it before they had even started looking. Danielle's eyes stayed on the screen, calm, focused, as if she was not surprised, only patient, and for a brief second her mind slipped again, not away from the moment, but deeper into it, back to a conference room years ago, where she had sat at the end of a long table, presenting numbers that outperformed every benchmark, only to be told her approach did not align with their vision, and she remembered the look on their faces, polite, dismissive, certain they were protecting something they never questioned, and now here it was again, not in a room of executives, but in lines of code that carried the same quiet decisions forward without ever speaking them out loud. "Show the decision logs," Danielle said, her voice cutting through the room with precision. And this time the analyst did not hesitate, his fingers moving quickly, almost urgently, as if he needed to see it for himself before anyone else could deny it. And when the logs appeared, the pattern became undeniable. Repeated actions, repeated exclusions, each one justified by the system as efficient, optimized, necessary, but together forming something far more deliberate. The developer shook his head slowly. "This is baked into the core logic," he said, his voice carrying both disbelief and realization. "It was not an accident." And the manager opened her mouth to respond, to defend, to redirect, but no words came out, because the room had already moved past explanation and into exposure. Danielle finally turned away from the screen, her gaze sweeping across the faces in front of her, not with anger, not with accusation, but with a clarity that made everything else feel smaller. "You trusted the system because it felt objective," she said, her tone steady. "But systems only reflect the decisions they are built on, and the weight of that sentence settled over the room, because it was not loud, it was not dramatic, it was final." The security officer near the entrance shifted again, no longer sure why he was there, his presence now out of place in a situation that had outgrown simple enforcement, and the analyst leaned back slightly, his chair creaking softly, as if even the smallest sound now carried more meaning than before. The manager tried again, her voice quieter, almost careful. "We can escalate this internally," she said, reaching for structure, for process, for anything that could contain what was happening, but Danielle did not respond immediately. She simply looked at her, holding the moment long enough for the truth to settle fully into the space between them, and then she spoke, not louder, but sharper. "It is already internal," she said, and that was the moment the room understood that this was not a report waiting to be filed, not an issue waiting to be reviewed, but a reality already unfolding in real time, one that could not be delayed or redirected, because the system had already shown what it was designed to do. And Danielle was no longer here to question it. She was here to change it. The manager's composure did not shatter. It unraveled slowly, thread by thread, as the weight of what stood on those screens pressed against every excuse she had left, and for the first time since Danielle walked in, her posture shifted from authority to defense, subtle but unmistakable, like someone realizing the room they controlled no longer belonged to them. "We can contain this," she said again, quieter now, almost careful, as if choosing the wrong word might make everything worse. But Danielle's gaze did not soften, did not move. It stayed locked with a precision that made the silence feel heavier than any argument, because containment was no longer possible, not when the system itself was speaking, The analyst swallowed, his voice unsteady as he scrolled further through the logs. There are escalation paths that were never triggered, he said, pointing at the screen. Profiles were flagged but never reviewed by a human, and the developer leaned in, adding, "It is automated." Exclusion. The phrase landed like a quiet verdict, not dramatic, but final, and the manager shook her head again, though this time it felt more like refusal than disagreement. "That is not how we trained it," she insisted, but even as she spoke, her eyes flickered toward the data, searching for something, anything, that could contradict what was already clear. Danielle took a slow step forward, not aggressive, not confrontational, just enough to close the distance between her and the screen. Her reflection now sharper against the glow of the system, and when she spoke, her voice carried a clarity that cut through every layer of uncertainty. "You trained it with assumptions," she said, "and then you trusted it to act like facts," and the room did not respond, because there was nothing left to challenge in that statement. A faint hum filled the space, the quiet sound of servers processing, systems updating, as if the infrastructure itself was aware that something fundamental had shifted, and the security officer near the entrance finally stepped back completely, his presence dissolving into the background, no longer relevant in a situation that had moved far beyond physical control. The developer's hands moved again, faster now, driven by urgency, pulling comparative datasets, overlays, historical trends, and with each layer the same pattern repeated, undeniable, consistent, built into the architecture itself, and he exhaled slowly. "This was designed to filter out risk," he said, then paused, correcting himself, "but it defined risk based on bias." The distinction hung in the air, sharp and unavoidable. Danielle's expression did not change, but her eyes carried something deeper now. Not just observation, but decision, and for a moment the room felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for what came next. The manager straightened slightly, grasping for structure again. "We can open an internal review," she said, her voice steadier than before but still lacking its earlier confidence. "We can bring in compliance, legal, fix the parameters," and Danielle finally turned fully toward her, her gaze steady, unwavering. "You cannot fix what you refuse to name," she said, and the words landed with a quiet finality that made the idea of a simple review feel almost irrelevant. Behind them, the developer froze as a new alert appeared on his screen, one that none of them had triggered, his eyes widening slightly as he read it. "There is a system override request," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, and the analyst leaned over quickly, scanning the details, confusion spreading across his face. "This is not coming from our level," he added, and for a brief moment the room felt suspended, caught between what had already been revealed and something new beginning to unfold. Danielle did not react immediately, but her hand moved once more, calm, deliberate, tapping her phone again, as if aligning something already in motion. And when she spoke, her voice was quieter than before, but carried more weight than anything said so far. "You are not seeing a glitch," she said, her eyes moving from the screen back to the manager. "You are seeing access." And that was the moment the room shifted again, deeper this time because access meant authority, and authority meant everything they thought they controlled was no longer theirs to manage. The analyst stepped back from the terminal, his hands lifting slightly as if distancing himself from the system, while the developer stared at the incoming changes, watching permissions realign, restrictions dissolve, and layers of control move beyond their reach, and the manager, for the first time, said nothing at all, because the realization had finally settled in, not all at once, but enough to understand that this was no longer about defending a process or correcting an error. It was about facing something far larger than any of them had prepared for, and Danielle stood at the center of it, calm, composed, not as someone reacting to the system, but as someone who had already decided what would happen next. The alert did not just sit on the screen. It expanded, line by line, like something waking up after being silent for too long, and the developer leaned closer, his breath shallow now as new permissions cascaded across the interface, unlocking layers that had never been visible from this level before. "This is executive access," he said, his voice tight with disbelief, and the analyst's eyes widened as he scanned the authorization trail. No, this is above that, he corrected, almost under his breath, because the system was not just responding, it was restructuring itself in real time. Danielle stood unmoved, her posture unchanged, but the air around her felt heavier, more defined, like everything in the room was beginning to orbit a truth that had not yet been spoken out loud, and the manager, who had been searching for control just moments ago, now looked at the screens as if they were no longer hers to interpret. Her voice quieter than before. "Who initiated this?" she asked, though the question carried more hesitation than authority, and no one answered immediately, because the answer was already forming in front of them, hidden in plain sight within the access log scrolling across the display. The developer's fingers trembled slightly as he highlighted a line, then another, tracing the origin point, and when he finally spoke, the words came out slower than he intended. "This override, it is tied to a primary ownership key." And the analyst leaned in, scanning the identifier, his voice dropping even lower. "There are only a few of those," he said, "and they do not come from within this floor." The implication settled into the room like a weight no one could lift. Danielle's reflection in the glass sharpened as the screens brightened, her presence no longer blending into the environment but defining it, and for a brief second, the memory of another room crossed her mind, not distant, not faded, but clear. A boardroom years ago where she had listened as executives debated access, control, ownership, using words like scalability and efficiency while never acknowledging the people affected by those decisions, and she remembered sitting there, silent, absorbing every detail, knowing that one day she would not just be part of the conversation, she would own it. Back in the present, the developer scrolled further, uncovering deeper permissions, deeper structures, layers that controlled not just outcomes but the rules themselves, and he shook his head slowly. "This is not just access," he said. "This is control over the framework." And the manager took another small step back, her heels barely making a sound, but the movement was enough to signal what she was beginning to understand, that whatever authority she believed she had was no longer relevant in this moment. The analyst glanced at Danielle again, this time with a different expression, no longer dismissive, no longer certain, but searching, almost cautious, as if he was trying to reconcile the person standing in front of him with the level of access, now rewriting the system behind him, and Danielle finally moved her gaze from the screens to meet his, her voice calm, steady, leaving no room for doubt. "You asked who initiated it," she said, and the room seemed to hold its breath again, waiting, because the answer was no longer just technical, it was personal. The developer froze as a final confirmation line appeared, the system requiring acknowledgement of the override authority, and without hesitation, Danielle reached forward, her hand steady as she tapped once on the terminal. Not rushed, not dramatic, just precise. And the system responded instantly, the interface shifting, reorganizing, acknowledging her input in a way it had not acknowledged anyone else in that room. The analyst stepped back, his chair scraping softly against the floor, the sound louder than it should have been in the silence that followed, and the manager's voice, when it came, was no longer controlled, no longer measured, but uncertain. "Who are you?" she asked, and Danielle did not answer immediately. She let the question sit, let the weight of everything that had just unfolded settle into the space between them, before finally speaking, her tone unchanged, but carrying a finality that made every screen in the room feel like it was now aligned with her words. "I am the reason this system exists," she said, and the impact of that statement did not explode. It sank, deep and irreversible, because it was not a claim, it was a fact the system itself had already confirmed, and in that moment, every assumption that had been made about her, every decision that had been justified by policy, collapsed under the reality now standing in front of them, as Danielle Carter remained exactly where she had been from the start, calm, composed, but no longer underestimated, because the system they trusted had just answered the question they never thought to ask. The words did not echo, but they did not need to, because the system had already confirmed them before anyone else could process what she had just said, and for a moment no one moved, not the analyst, not the developer, not even the manager whose authority had quietly unraveled in front of her own team. The screens behind the counter continued to shift, permissions updating, access layers realigning, and what once looked like a controlled environment now felt exposed, like a structure with its foundations suddenly visible. The analyst took a slow step back, his voice barely steady. "You are the owner?" he asked, not out of doubt, but because he needed to hear it said in a way his mind could accept, and Danielle did not rush to respond. She let the silence stretch just long enough for the weight of the system's reaction to settle fully into the room before she spoke again, calm, precise. "I am the one who built the framework your system runs on," and the distinction mattered, because ownership was one thing, but creation meant something deeper, something that could not be dismissed or reassigned. The developer exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair as he stared at the layers now open in front of him. "Then you already knew," he said, not as a question, but as a realization, and Danielle's eyes flickered slightly, acknowledging the truth without needing to explain it, because knowing was not the same as exposing, and exposing required something the system itself had just provided. The manager straightened, instinctively trying to reclaim a sense of structure, but the confidence was gone, replaced with something more cautious, more measured. "If this is the case, we can address it at a higher level," she said, choosing her words carefully now. "This does not need to escalate publicly," and Danielle turned her gaze toward her, not with confrontation, but with clarity, the kind that made every word feel intentional. "It already has," she said, and the manager's expression tightened, confusion flickering across her face. "What do you mean?" she asked, and Danielle did not answer with explanation. She answered with action. She lifted her phone once more, her movements steady, deliberate, and as she tapped the screen, the system behind the desk responded instantly, a new interface appearing across the monitors, one that none of them had seen before, a live audit feed broadcasting the system's internal behavior in real time, not just within this room, but across every connected branch, every node, every decision point tied to the framework. The developer's eyes widened as the feed expanded, data streaming faster now, patterns replicating across regions, across user groups, the same bias repeated at scale, and he shook his head in disbelief. "This is global," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, and the analyst leaned forward again, unable to look away. "This cannot be contained," he added, the words coming out faster now, urgency replacing hesitation. The manager stepped closer to the screen, her reflection merging with the data she could no longer control. "Shut it down," she said suddenly, her voice sharper than before, reaching for authority that no longer responded to her. But nothing changed. The system did not pause, did not comply, because the command no longer belonged to her. Danielle watched her for a moment, not with satisfaction, not with anger, but with something quieter, something resolved. "You cannot shut down what you do not control," she said, and the sentence settled into the room like a boundary that could not be crossed. Behind them, the security officer had fully stepped away, his role now irrelevant, his presence reduced to observation like everyone else, and the developer's hands hovered over the keyboard again, uncertain now not because he lacked skill, but because he understood the scale of what he was seeing. Danielle took a small step forward, closing the distance between herself and the center of the system, her voice steady, carrying a final layer of clarity that none of them could ignore. "This was never about one flagged account," she said, her eyes moving briefly across each of them. "It was about a system that learned the wrong lessons and kept repeating them, and the room did not respond, because there was nothing left to argue, nothing left to deny. The system continued to run, exposing itself with every passing second, and for the first time since this began, it was clear to everyone present that this was no longer a situation unfolding in a single room. It was something far larger, something already moving beyond their reach, and Danielle stood at the center of it, not reacting, not explaining, but preparing, because what came next was not just exposure, it was change. The system did not slow down, it accelerated, the live audit feed expanding beyond the boundaries of the room, streaming across regions, departments, decision layers that had operated quietly for years, and now every line of data carried a weight it never had before because it was no longer hidden behind assumptions. The analyst leaned forward again, unable to pull himself away, his voice tighter now. "This is being mirrored externally," he said, scanning the upper corner of the interface, where a new indicator blinked steadily. And the developer followed his gaze, his expression shifting from confusion to realization. "This is not just internal visibility," he added. "This is being routed to executive channels," and the managers had snapped toward them, her composure cracking further as the implications landed. "Stop it," she said, sharper this time, stepping closer to the console as if proximity alone could restore control. "You need to shut this down now." But no one moved, because no one in that room had the authority to respond to that command anymore. Danielle stood exactly where she had been, her presence steady, almost quiet, but now unmistakably central, like the axis everything else was turning around. And when she spoke, her voice did not rise. It did not need to. "It is not leaking," she said, her eyes fixed on the screen. "It is reporting." And the distinction settled into the space like a line that could not be crossed back over. The developer exhaled slowly, his hands resting just above the keyboard. "This is going straight to the board," he said, the words carrying both disbelief and inevitability, and the analyst nodded once, almost reflexively. "And compliance and legal," he added, as if listing them out might somehow reduce the impact, but it did not. It only made the scale clearer. The manager took another step back, her reflection now fragmented across multiple screens, each one showing a different part of the same truth, and for the first time her voice lowered. "Not out of control, but caution. You are forcing a full exposure," she said, and Danielle finally turned her head slightly, meeting her gaze with a calm that felt sharper than confrontation. "No," she replied. "The system is." And that was the moment the room understood that this was not an attack, not a disruption, but a consequence unfolding exactly as it had been designed to, just not in the way anyone expected. A soft tone sounded from the terminal, not an alarm, not a warning, but a confirmation, and the developer's eyes flicked to the notification as it appeared, his voice barely above a whisper. "Audit acknowledgement received," he read, then paused, his expression tightening. "From multiple executive nodes." And the analyst stepped back again, his chair rolling slightly behind him, the sound small but echoing in the stillness, because now it was no longer just their system, it was the company itself becoming aware in real time. Danielle's gaze returned to the screens, her posture unchanged, but something in the room felt different now, less tense, more defined, like the moment before a decision becomes action. And for a brief second, her mind moved back again, not to a single memory but a series of them, moments where systems like this had shaped outcomes without accountability, where decisions were justified by data that no one questioned deeply enough, and she remembered making a choice long before this moment, not to avoid those systems, but to build something better, something that could be corrected when it failed. Back in the present, the manager tried once more, her voice steadier than before but carrying a different tone, not authority, but negotiation. "We can manage this internally," she said. "We can address the bias, recalibrate the algorithm, issue a statement." And Danielle listened, not interrupting, not reacting, until the words settled completely, and then she responded, her tone even, precise. "You cannot recalibrate what was built without accountability," she said, and the words did not land as criticism, they landed as fact. The developer's screen flickered again as a new layer of access opened, deeper than before, and he leaned in, his voice quiet but clear. "There is a system-wide command queue forming," he said, and the analyst looked over quickly. "What kind of commands?" he asked, and the developer hesitated, reading through the entries as they populated. "Structural changes," he answered, his eyes moving rapidly across the screen. "Permissions, thresholds, decision weights, it is preparing for a rebuild." And the word hung in the air, heavier than anything else that had been said, because rebuild did not mean adjustment, it meant replacement. Danielle finally took a slow step forward, her hand resting lightly on the edge of the console, her presence now fully aligned with the system that had just revealed itself. And when she spoke again, her voice carried a clarity that left no room for interpretation. "This is not about fixing what happened today," she said, her eyes steady. It is about making sure it cannot happen again. And the room did not respond, because at that point, everyone understood that whatever came next was no longer a discussion. It was a decision already in motion. One that had started the moment the system stopped hiding and started telling the truth. The word rebuild did not fade. It settled, heavy and irreversible, as the system continued assembling its command queue in silence, each line of code appearing with quiet precision, not rushed, not chaotic, but intentional, like something that had been waiting for permission it never thought it would receive. The developer stared at the sequence forming on his screen, his voice steady now but filled with something deeper than disbelief. "These are not patches," he said, scrolling slowly as new instructions populated. "These are structural overrides," and the analyst leaned closer, his earlier hesitation replaced by focus. "It is rewriting the decision logic," he added, his eyes moving quickly across the variables, the weights, the thresholds that once defined access and exclusion. The manager stood still, no longer reaching for the console, no longer issuing commands, because the system had moved beyond her reach in a way she could not reverse, and for the first time, she did not speak immediately. She watched, absorbing what was unfolding with a clarity that had replaced denial. Danielle remained at the center, her hand still resting lightly on the console, not controlling every action, but guiding the direction. Her presence aligned with the system in a way that felt less like intervention and more like correction. "Show the new parameters," she said quietly, and the developer responded without hesitation, pulling up the evolving framework as it took shape in real time. And when the display shifted, the difference was immediate, visible not in complexity, but in balance. The variables no longer skewed toward hidden assumptions. The weightings redistributed in a way that reflected intention rather than bias. The analyst exhaled slowly. "It is removing the automated exclusion layers," he said, almost to himself, and the developer nodded, "and replacing them with transparent review paths," he added, his voice carrying a sense of clarity that had not been there before. The manager took a small step forward again, not to stop the process, but to understand it, her voice quieter now, stripped of its earlier certainty. "This will change how every decision is made," she said, and Danielle turned her gaze slightly toward her, not dismissing the statement, but confirming it. "That is the point," she replied, and the simplicity of the answer made the impact even stronger, because it left no room for compromise. The system continued to update, each change locking into place as soon as it was written, and the developer's screen filled with confirmation lines, permissions realigning across regions, departments, access points that had once operated under a single flawed logic, now adapting to something new, something more deliberate. The analyst leaned back slightly, his expression shifting from tension to realization. "This is not just a correction," he said, "it is a replacement." And the word carried weight, because replacement meant the old system was not coming back, not in its original form, not in any form that could quietly continue what it had been doing. Danielle's eyes moved across the room, not searching, not questioning, but observing, and for a brief moment, the noise of the system faded behind something else, a memory not of failure, but of decision, the moment she chose to build something different, knowing it would not be perfect, but believing it could be accountable. Back in the present, the manager's reflection in the screen steadied, her posture no longer defensive, but grounded, as she watched the changes finalize. "This will require full alignment across leadership," she said, her voice measured, acknowledging the scale of what was happening, and Danielle nodded once, a small movement that carried more authority than any command issued earlier. "They're already watching," she said, her gaze returning to the interface, where the audit feed continued to stream, now paired with the active rebuild, transparency layered over transformation. The developer paused as a final sequence began to execute, his fingers hovering above the keyboard, not out of uncertainty, but respect for the moment. "Final integration phase," he said, his voice clear, and the analyst leaned in again, following the process as it locked into place, each command confirming, each layer stabilizing. Danielle lifted her hand slightly from the console, not withdrawing, but releasing control back into the system now that it had been redirected, her voice calm, steady, carrying a quiet finality. A system does not change because someone points out the problem, she said, her eyes fixed on the final lines of code as they executed. It changes because someone takes responsibility for what it becomes. And as the last confirmation appeared on the screen, the room did not erupt. It did not celebrate, it settled, because what had just happened was not a moment. It was a shift, one that would continue long after this room returned to silence, and Danielle Carter stood there, exactly as she had from the beginning, calm, composed, but now undeniable, not as someone who challenged the system, but as someone who had just rebuilt it. The final confirmation did not arrive with noise. It appeared quietly, a single line across the screen that read complete, and yet the weight of that word filled the entire room, because nothing about what had just happened was small. Nothing about it could be undone with a simple command or reversed with a quiet update. The system stabilized, the rapid flow of changes slowing into a steady rhythm, no longer exposing, no longer rewriting, but operating under a new set of rules that were visible, traceable, accountable, and for the first time since Danielle had stepped into the space, the silence that followed was not tense, it was clear. The analyst sat back fully in his chair, his shoulders lowering as if something he did not realize he was holding had finally released, his eyes still fixed on the screen, but now searching differently. Not for errors, not for anomalies, but for understanding. "It is done," he said quietly, as if saying it louder might disturb the balance that had just been created, and the developer nodded slowly, scrolling through the updated structure, verifying what the system itself had already confirmed. Every decision path is now logged. Every flag requires human review, and the weighting is neutralized across all profiles, he said, his voice steady. Grounded in the reality he was now seeing rather than the assumptions he had worked under before, the manager stood motionless for a moment longer. Her reflection no longer fractured across conflicting data, but aligned with a system that no longer supported the patterns she had once defended, and when she finally spoke, her voice carried something new, not authority, not denial, but recognition. "This will change everything," she said, and Danielle turned slightly toward her, her expression calm, unchanged, but her eyes holding a depth that made the statement feel almost understated. "It already has," she replied, and the finality in her tone did not challenge, it settled. The security officer near the entrance shifted his stance again, not out of tension, but uncertainty about his place in a situation that had moved far beyond anything he was trained to manage, and slowly, almost instinctively, he stepped further back, giving space to something he could not define but understood he should not interrupt. The developer leaned forward again, this time not out of urgency, but intention, running a final series of checks, confirming the integration across multiple regions, and each confirmation returned clean, consistent, aligned with the new structure. "It is holding," he said, almost with a sense of disbelief, and the analyst let out a quiet breath. "Then it is real," he added, as if the system itself needed to be acknowledged not just as updated, but transformed. Danielle's hand rested lightly at her side now, no longer interacting with the console, because there was nothing left to initiate, nothing left to correct in this moment, and for a brief second, her gaze softened, not with relief, but with reflection, a silent recognition of how many moments had led to this one, how many time systems like this had operated unchecked, shaping outcomes without accountability, and how rare it was for that pattern to be interrupted in a way that could not be ignored. The manager took a step closer, not toward the console, but toward Danielle, her voice measured, careful. "What happens next?" she asked, and the question did not carry resistance, it carried acceptance, the kind that comes when denial is no longer possible. And Danielle looked at her for a moment, letting the question settle fully before answering. Her tone steady, grounded. "Now it operates the way it should have from the beginning," she said, and the simplicity of the answer carried more weight than any explanation could have, because it did not describe a process, it defined a standard. The system continued to run in the background, its presence no longer overwhelming, but steady, integrated into the space in a way that felt different, not invisible, but transparent. And the developer watched it for a moment longer before leaning back, his posture finally relaxed. "We built something that learned the wrong things," he said quietly, almost to himself, and Danielle's eyes moved briefly toward him, acknowledging the truth in the statement without judgment. "And now it has been taught something better," she replied, and the room did not respond, because there was nothing left to argue, nothing left to defend. The transformation had already happened, not announced, not celebrated, but completed, and as the silence settled once more, it carried a different meaning, not absence but clarity, because everyone in that room now understood that what they had just witnessed was not just a correction, it was a line drawn between what was acceptable and what was no longer allowed to continue, and Danielle Carter stood there, exactly as she had from the beginning, calm, composed, but now unmistakably the force that had turned a hidden flaw into a visible change, one that would not disappear when the room returned to its normal routine, because it had already moved beyond it. The system no longer demanded attention, it earned it quietly, operating in the background with a steadiness that had never existed before, and yet no one in the room could look away, not because something was wrong, but because everything had changed in a way that made the old version impossible to forget. The analyst leaned forward again, not with urgency this time, but with intent. Reviewing the audit trail now visible across every decision layer, his voice calm but edged with something new. "Every action is traceable now," he said, scrolling through the logs that no longer hid behind abstraction. "There is no place left for silent filtering," and the developer nodded slowly, his eyes moving across the updated framework. "And every override requires justification," he added. "It records who, when, and why." And the simplicity of that structure carried more weight than any complex safeguard they had relied on before. The manager stood still, her posture no longer defensive, no longer authoritative, but reflective, as if she was seeing her role in a system she had never fully questioned, and when she spoke, her voice was quieter, more grounded. "We thought efficiency meant removing friction," she said, almost to herself, and Danielle turned her head slightly, her expression unchanged, but her response immediate. "Efficiency without accountability creates distance," she said, and the words settled into the space with a clarity that made everything else feel secondary. The developer paused for a moment, his fingers resting on the keyboard as he considered what he had just witnessed, not as a technical process, but as a shift in perspective. "We optimized for speed," he said, "but we never asked what we were speeding past," and the analyst let out a quiet breath. "Or who," he added, and the room held that realization without needing to expand on it, because the system now displayed the answer in ways it never had before. Danielle stepped back slightly from the console, not distancing herself, but allowing the system to stand on its own. Her presence no longer required to guide it, and for a brief moment, the room felt different again, not charged, not tense, but grounded, like something had been set in place that would not shift easily. The manager looked at Danielle, her gaze steady now, no longer searching for control, but for understanding. "You could have handled this quietly," she said, not as a challenge, but as a recognition of choice, and Danielle met her eyes without hesitation, her voice calm, deliberate. "Quiet fixes protect the system, not the people affected by it," she said, and the distinction carried a weight that could not be ignored. The analyst leaned back in his chair, his posture finally relaxed, but his eyes still fixed on the interface. "This is going to change how every report is reviewed," he said, almost with a sense of inevitability, and the developer nodded. "And how every decision is questioned," he added, because the system no longer allowed assumptions to pass without visibility. The security officer near the entrance shifted again, then stilled, his role now fully removed from the center of the moment, and for the first time, he seemed to understand that what had happened here was not something he could enforce or prevent, it was something that had to be understood. Danielle's gaze moved across the room once more, not assessing, not judging, but acknowledging, and when she spoke again, her voice carried a final clarity that felt less like a conclusion and more like a standard being set. "A system is only as fair as the people willing to question it," she said, her eyes steady. And today, it was questioned, and the room did not respond with agreement or resistance. It responded with silence, the kind that comes when something true does not need to be argued. The developer looked back at the screen, watching the system operate under its new structure, every decision logged, every pathway visible, and for a moment, he smiled faintly, not out of relief, but recognition. "It is different now," he said, and Danielle did not correct him, but her expression suggested something deeper, something more complete, because different was not the goal, accountable was. The manager took a slow breath, her posture settling into something more aligned with the reality in front of her. "Then we start from here," she said, not as a directive, but as an acceptance of what came next. And Danielle nodded once, a small movement that carried more authority than anything said before, because it was not about control anymore, it was about responsibility. The system continued to run, steady, transparent, and as the room began to return to stillness, it was clear that what had just happened was not an interruption. It was a reset, one that would carry forward into every decision made from this point on, and Danielle Carter stood there, not as someone who had disrupted the system, but as someone who had forced it to become what it should have been all along. The room did not return to what it was. It adjusted, slowly, deliberately, like a space learning new rules in real time, and even though the screens had stabilized, even though the system now ran with a quiet consistency, no one moved too quickly, as if speed itself had become something to question. The analyst remained seated, but his posture had changed, no longer leaning forward in reaction, but sitting upright with intention, his eyes scanning the live logs not for errors, but for patterns that now had to be understood. "Every decision is being reviewed differently," he said, his voice steady, thoughtful, "not just by the system, but by us." And the weight of that shift settled into the air, because for the first time, the responsibility was no longer abstract. The developer nodded slowly, his fingers resting still on the keyboard, something he had not done once since this began. "The system is no longer making silent assumptions," he said, "which means we cannot either." And the simplicity of that realization carried more weight than any technical change they had just witnessed. The manager stood a few steps away from the console now, her position no longer at the center, but still present, still engaged, and when she spoke, her voice carried something that had not been there before, not control, not defense, but accountability. "This changes how we lead," she said, her gaze fixed on the system that had once followed her direction without question. "We cannot hide behind what it decides anymore." And Danielle, standing calmly near the console, turned slightly toward her, her expression steady, acknowledging the shift without needing to reinforce it, because the truth had already been established. For a brief moment, the room held a different kind of silence, not the kind filled with tension, but the kind filled with awareness, the kind that follows a realization too clear to ignore, and Danielle's eyes moved across the space once more, not observing individuals, but the system as a whole, now functioning in alignment with something it had been missing from the beginning. A notification appeared softly on the upper corner of the screen, not urgent, not alarming, but significant, and the analyst noticed it first, his eyes narrowing slightly as he read it. "Board acknowledgement received," he said, his voice low but clear, and the developer leaned in just enough to confirm. "They are not just aware," he added. "They are reviewing the changes in real time," and the manager exhaled slowly, not out of relief, but recognition of the scale now fully realized. "This is no longer local," she said, and Danielle's response came without hesitation, calm, grounded. "It never was," she said, and the truth of that statement settled deeper than anything before it, because it reframed the entire moment, not as an isolated incident, but as a systemic correction. The security officer, who had remained near the entrance, finally shifted his stance completely, his posture relaxing as he stepped further back, no longer positioned as a presence of authority, but as a witness to something that had nothing to do with enforcement and everything to do with understanding. The developer leaned back in his chair, his gaze still fixed on the system, but now with a different focus. "We're going to have to relearn how to build," he said quietly, almost as if speaking to himself, and the analyst nodded once. "And how to question what we build," he added, and Danielle's eyes softened slightly at that, not in approval, but in recognition, because that was always the point, not just to change a system, but to change the way people interacted with it. The manager took one small step closer again, not toward the console, but toward Danielle, her voice measured, steady. "This will be documented," she said, "every part of it," and Danielle met her gaze, her tone even, unwavering. "It should be," she replied, and there was no tension in the exchange, no resistance, only alignment, because the need for transparency had already been proven. The system continued to operate quietly, every decision now visible, every pathway traceable, and as the room settled into its new rhythm, it became clear that what had just happened was not a moment that would fade. It was a shift that would carry forward into every future decision, every future design, every future assumption that would now have to be questioned before it became reality. Danielle stood there, exactly as she had from the beginning, composed, steady, but now the difference was undeniable, not in how she carried herself, but in how the room responded to her, because the system they trusted had changed under her presence, and more importantly, so had they. The system did not celebrate, it held steady, and that steadiness carried more weight than any announcement ever could, because it meant the change was not temporary, not symbolic, but embedded into every decision that would follow. The screens continued to glow with quiet clarity, every line of data now readable, every outcome traceable, and for the first time, no one in the room looked away, because there was nothing left to hide from. The analyst leaned forward once more, not out of urgency, but responsibility, reviewing a live case as it processed through the new framework, his voice calm, deliberate. "This one would have been flagged before," he said, watching the system routed differently, "but now it is being reviewed instead of rejected," and the developer nodded slowly, his eyes tracking the same case. "It is asking for context, not assuming risk," he added, and the distinction, simple as it sounded, marked a complete shift in how the system understood people. The manager stood beside them now, no longer apart, no longer directing, but participating, her gaze fixed on the process unfolding in front of her, and when she spoke, her voice carried something that had replaced authority, awareness. "We built something that made decisions faster than we could question them," she said, and Danielle, standing just behind the console, responded without hesitation, her tone steady, grounded. "And now it moves at the speed of accountability," she said, and the words did not slow the system. They redefined its purpose. A soft notification appeared again at the top of the interface. Another acknowledgement, another layer of oversight connecting to what had just been rebuilt, and the analyst noticed it immediately. "More executive nodes are syncing," he said, his voice carrying a quiet certainty. "They are not just observing anymore, they are aligning with it." And the developer leaned back slightly, processing the scale of what that meant. "This is becoming the standard," he said, and the manager did not argue, did not question. She simply nodded once, because the evidence was already in front of her. Danielle's gaze moved across the room again, not searching, not assessing, but recognizing, because what had changed was not just the system, it was the way everyone in that space now interacted with it, the hesitation before decisions, the awareness behind every action, the understanding that efficiency without reflection was no longer acceptable. For a brief moment, the hum of the system faded into the background, and Danielle's mind moved through a series of memories, not with emotion but with clarity, moments where decisions were made without explanation, where access was denied without accountability, where systems like this operated as silent gatekeepers, and she remembered how those moments did not stop her, they shaped her. They defined the standard she refused to lower, and now, standing here, she was not correcting one moment, she was rewriting the pattern that created them. Back in the present, the developer ran one final check, not because he expected failure, but because the habit of questioning had already taken root, and when the system responded cleanly, consistently, he allowed himself a small nod. "It is holding under live conditions," he said, and the analyst added quietly, "Then it is ready," and the words carried a sense of transition, not an ending, but a beginning of something that would continue beyond this room. The manager turned slightly toward Danielle, her posture no longer rigid, no longer uncertain, but aligned with the reality that had just unfolded. "We will need to communicate this across every level," she said, her voice measured. "Training, policy, leadership," and Danielle met her gaze, her expression unchanged, but her answer immediate. Start with understanding, she said. Everything else follows that. And the simplicity of her response carried more direction than any structured plan. The system continued to operate, steady, transparent, and as the room settled into a new rhythm, it became clear that what had happened here was not just a correction of code. It was a redefinition of responsibility, a shift from assumption to awareness, from silence to visibility, and from control to accountability. The security officer near the entrance finally turned slightly toward the exit, not leaving, but no longer anchored to the moment, because his role had been replaced by something else entirely, something that did not require enforcement, only understanding. Danielle stood there, exactly as she had from the beginning, composed, steady, but now the difference was undeniable, not because she had raised her voice, not because she had demanded control, but because she had revealed what was already there and refused to let it remain hidden. And as the system continued to run under its new structure, one truth remained clear in the quiet that followed. This was not just a fix, it was a standard that could not be ignored anymore. The room did not reset. It carried forward, every screen, every breath, every quiet glance holding the weight of what had just been rewritten, and yet nothing about Danielle Carter's presence changed. She stood exactly where she had from the beginning, composed, grounded, untouched by the chaos that had unfolded around her, because for her, this was never chaos, it was correction. The system continued to run with a calm precision that felt unfamiliar but right, like a machine finally aligned with the purpose it had always claimed to serve, and the analyst, still seated, looked at the interface one more time, not searching, not doubting, but confirming. There are no silent flags anymore, he said, his voice steady, almost reflective. Every decision leaves a trace, and the developer nodded slowly, his hands resting away from the keyboard now, a rare stillness replacing constant motion. And every trace can be questioned, he added, and the two statements together formed something larger than code. They formed a boundary that could not be crossed without consequence. The manager stood just behind them, her posture no longer rigid, no longer defensive, but aligned with a reality she could not deny. And when she spoke, her voice carried something new, not authority, not hesitation, but ownership. This does not end here, she said, looking at the system that had once answered to her direction. This becomes the foundation for everything we build next. And Danielle turned slightly toward her, her expression calm, unwavering. Then build it with awareness, she said, and the simplicity of the instruction carried more weight than any policy ever written. The developer let out a quiet breath, his gaze still fixed on the system as it processed another live case, this time without bias, without silent exclusion, just data, context, and review. It is strange, he said softly, seeing it work the way it should have all along, and the analyst gave a small nod. It is not strange, he replied. It is just new to us. And that distinction settled into the space with quiet clarity. Danielle's eyes moved across the room one last time, not to check, not to confirm, but to acknowledge, because what had shifted here was not temporary, it was structural, and for a moment, her mind reflected not on the system, but on the people in the room, how quickly certainty had turned into doubt, how doubt had turned into understanding, and how understanding had now turned into responsibility. The security officer near the entrance finally stepped aside completely, no longer positioned at the edge of the moment, because there was no longer anything to enforce, only something to carry forward. The system continued its steady rhythm, no longer demanding attention, but deserving it. Every decision visible, every outcome accountable, and as the room settled into that new normal, the silence that followed was not empty, it was full, filled with awareness, filled with the understanding that what had just happened could not be undone or ignored. The manager took one final step closer to the console, her reflection now steady, aligned with the system she once trusted without question, and she spoke quietly, not to Danielle, not to the room, but almost to herself. "We thought we built something powerful," she said, "but we did not realize what it was doing." And Danielle's response came without hesitation, her voice calm, precise. "Power without accountability always reveals itself eventually," she said, and the truth of that statement settled deeper than anything before it. The developer looked back at the screen one last time, then leaned back fully in his chair, his posture finally relaxed, but his expression thoughtful. "This changes how we think," he said. And the analyst added quietly, "It has to, because anything less would mean returning to what had already been exposed." Danielle stepped back from the console, not withdrawing, but releasing the space back to those who would now carry the responsibility forward. Her presence no longer needed to guide the system, because the system had already been aligned with something greater than any single decision. And as she turned slightly toward the exit, her voice came one last time, calm, steady, carrying a final clarity that did not demand attention but commanded understanding. "You did not need to know who I was to do what was right," she said, her eyes steady. "You only needed to choose it." And with that, the room did not respond with words. It responded with silence, the kind that holds truth long after the moment has passed, because what had been revealed here was not just a system flaw, it was a choice. And now, it was one they could no longer ignore.